Think about communication for a second. It's the absolute backbone of every relationship we have, right?
Absolutely. Romantic, friends, family, even work. It's everywhere.
And sometimes, talking things through, connecting, it just feels, well, easy, natural, like you're really getting each other.
Yeah, those moments feel great. Effortless almost.
But then there are those other times when it feels like you're just hitting a brick wall.
Or speaking completely different languages, maybe. It can be baffling.
Utterly confusing, frustrating, sometimes even kind of painful, honestly.
And that experience, that feeling of hitting those unexpected roadblocks in communication, it's so incredibly common.
Right.
Yeah, but the reasons behind it, they can be really subtle. Deeply personal, often rooted in things we don't even consciously recognize. It's not always just about, finding the right words.
No, it feels deeper than that sometimes.
It's about navigating these layers of conditioning, these scripts we learn.
Exactly. And that brings us to the really fascinating angle for this deep dive. We're not just stopping at the surface level, like how to talk better.
We're going deeper.
Much deeper. We want to explore the complex, often kind of hidden ways our communication patterns, especially in our really close relationships, are shaped. Profoundly shaped, actually.
By what, specifically?
By societal ideas about masculinity.
Yeah.
And crucially, the really nuanced role of vulnerability within all of that.
Okay. So understanding how those societal scripts about being a man interact with, well, the basic human need for emotional expression.
Exactly. And vulnerability, and ultimately how we forge those truly deep, authentic connections with people.
It raises some big questions then. Like, how do those scripts maybe help connection in some ways, but also create pretty significant barriers in others?
That's the core of it. And to really unpack this, we've pulled together quite a stack of sources, giving us a whole range of perspectives.
What kind of sources are we looking at?
Well, we've got some practical relationship advice, the concrete, do this, not that kind of stuff.
Okay, the actionable tips.
Yeah. Then there's academic and clinical research on masculinity and mental health, exploring the social science behind these norms and their impacts.
Right, the why behind some of the patterns.
We'll also look at studies on vulnerability, specifically in therapy settings, like couples counseling, to see how these dynamics actually play out when people are actively trying to change them.
That's insightful, seeing it in action where change is the goal.
And then we'll weave in some broader explorations of gender from social science research just to get that larger cultural context.
So a real mix. Practical advice, social science theory, clinical insights, and cultural context. Sounds comprehensive.
We hope so. This collection lets us move from, the very practical surface of communication techniques
down into those deeper currents. Societal, psychological.
Exactly. The things that influence how easy, or frankly how challenging, it is for us to connect on that vulnerable level, especially perhaps for men navigating these landscapes.
Okay, so what's the mission here? What do we want listeners to take away?
So our mission for this deep dive is really to take all these insights from all these different sources and kind of synthesize them to help you, the listener, understand that profound connection
between what it means societally to be a man
and expressing emotion, embracing vulnerability, and being able to forge those deep, resilient bonds with others.
Got it. Giving a clearer picture of those often hidden dynamics.
Yeah, the ones that can make relationship communication feel so tricky or confusing, or maybe even risky sometimes.
So by the end, hopefully you'll have a more informed perspective, not just on what happens in communication, but maybe a deeper sense of why some of those challenges pop up.
Whether you're experiencing them yourself, or maybe seeing them play out with the men in your life.
It's about seeing the script beneath the conversation, understanding the programming almost.
Exactly. Okay, let's dive in. Let's start by laying some foundational groundwork. Let's draw from the more practical side of communication and relationships first.
Sounds good. Where do we begin?
Well, our sources, like that piece from Psychology Today on effective couples communication, they give us some really concrete, actionable starting points. They remind us that, successful communication isn't always some complex psychological maneuver.
Sometimes it's just about the basics, right? Getting the fundamentals right.
Totally. And they really emphasize that the environment you choose for those important, maybe difficult conversations, it matters hugely.
It's not just about finding a quiet place, is it? It's more nuanced.
Right. It's about creating a relatively neutral space.
Yeah.
Somewhere that feels safe, conducive to actually focusing.
Safe and focused. Yeah, that makes sense. The classic example they give is pretty telling.
Oh, the don't talk about money in bed one.
Exactly. Don't try to hash out finances or relationship conflict in bed. That space, ideally, should be for intimacy, rest, connection.
Not for wrestling with stressful stuff like bills or disagreements.
Right. You need a space where you can both be present, comfortable, and free from the pressures or associations of other activities.
So you're basically setting the physical stage to support the emotional work you need to do. Makes sense.
And speaking of being present, nonverbal cues are absolutely massive.
Oh, yeah. We think communication is just words, but it's so much more.
How we show up nonverbally sends these really powerful messages, turning off distractions, putting down the phone, stepping away from the computer.
Seems obvious, but how often do we actually do it consistently? It's a deliberate act, signaling, you have my attention.
And things like leaning in slightly, making appropriate eye contact. These aren't just like polite habits.
No, they're not filler. Psychology Today points out, these physical actions send a vital message of connection, a signal that you're actively engaged, interested, truly present with your partner.
And that nonverbal connection becomes even more critical when the topic itself is difficult, right? Sensitive, maybe conflictual.
Definitely. Why is that?
Well, the very nature of discussing a tough issue, something that caused hurt or disagreement, can inherently create distance, tension.
Right, you feel yourselves pulling apart, maybe.
Exactly. So those nonverbal cues, the eye contact, the open posture, no distractions, they work to counter that initial distance. They help maintain that feeling of, we're in this together, facing this challenge together.
Even when the topic itself might initially push you apart.
Precisely. And conversely, if you're avoiding eye contact, fidgeting, checking your phone.
It sends the opposite message,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Disconnected, disinterested, maybe even avoidant.
Yeah, it totally undermines the safety needed for deeper sharing. It says, I'm not really here with you on this.
Okay, so setting the stage physically, choosing the right environment, and showing up with your body language being present, engaged. That's step one. Creates the conditions for effective communication.
Got it. Foundation laid.
Now, central to building genuine connection, and something that often feels like the polar opposite of those traditional masculine norms we're going to get into, is vulnerability.
Ah, yes. The core of it, really. Our sources, like the one from Durgy Park, they frame vulnerability as absolutely central, essential for developing authentic connections, especially in romantic relationships.
Not just a nice to have, then.
No, not an optional extra. It's a core component. And one key tool for increasing that verbal intimacy, as the source notes, is self-disclosure.
Self-disclosure, what does that entail exactly?
It's not just random oversharing, or a stream of consciousness ramble. It's the intentional act of opening up about your inner world.
Sharing your thoughts, feelings?
Your fears, hopes, needs, past experiences, things that aren't immediately obvious to your partner. Showing what's underneath the surface.
And it's crucial that this isn't just a one-way street, right? That source really highlights reciprocal communication.
Yes, that's key. It means both partners feel comfortable sharing their inner landscape and they're responsive to each other's disclosures.
So it's like a dynamic exchange, a dance almost.
Exactly like a dance. One person opens up a little, takes a risk.
And the other receives it with empathy, understanding.
And maybe then opens up in return. That reciprocity builds trust over time.
How does that work? How does it build trust?
Well, when you take that risk, admitting a mistake, sharing a fear, expressing a deep need, and your partner meets it not with judgment or dismissal, but with empathy, acceptance.
Maybe even sharing something vulnerable themselves.
Right. That validates your courage. It reinforces the safety of the connection. It basically says, it's okay to be open here.
And that encourages more openness down the line. Deepens the bond.
Absolutely. But the flip side is also true. If vulnerability is met with indifference, criticism, or just silence, no reciprocal sharing.
It can shut things down pretty fast, I imagine.
Definitely. The person who tried to be vulnerable learns, okay, this isn't a safe space for this kind of exposure. They're less likely to try again.
Okay, before we move on, we should probably just quickly acknowledge intimacy barriers aren't always just emotional, right? Or about communication style.
That's a fair point. Sources like that overcoming barriers piece do mention physical aspects.
Things like health issues, chronic stress, demanding jobs or lifestyles.
Yeah, those can absolutely impact a couple's ability to connect, both physically and emotionally. They're very real, significant challenges.
And they need their own attention, for sure.
True. But for the specific focus of this deep dive, we are zeroing in on those emotional and communication aspects and how gendered ideas, particularly around masculinity, can create these specific hurdles.
And complicate that reciprocal dance of vulnerability we were just talking about.
Exactly. That's where the core insights of our sources for today really converge.
Okay, got it. So, foundation, practical communication creates safety, vulnerability via self-disclosure, and reciprocity builds connection. Now, let's shift gears dramatically.
Let's get into the social science perspective.
Yep. This is where we start to understand why, for many men, vulnerability can be such a challenging space to inhabit.
Okay. Historically, social science often talked about a single, fixed male sex role to understand gendered behavior, right?
Yeah, that was the dominant idea for a while.
But as the Handbook of Studies on Men and Masculinities explains, that concept, well, it's largely been criticized. It's become less dominant in current research.
Why the shift? What were the criticisms?
Well, the handbook points out several issues. It was seen as too rigid, too oversimplified. It just didn't capture the diversity of male experiences.
Lacked a power perspective too, right?
Yeah.
Didn't really address how social power structures influence these roles.
Exactly. And it was often ethnocentric, mainly focused on Western, white, middle-class men. It ignored how masculinity looks and works differently across cultures, classes, ethnicities.
Plus, it presented this static ideal. Didn't count for individual differences or how things change over a man's life.
Right. So instead of one monolithic male sex role, the field shifted towards understanding masculinities, plural.
Ah, multiple masculinities.
Yeah.
Based on social constructionism.
Precisely. Recognizing that what we consider masculine isn't some biological given. It's a category of ideas, emotions, behaviors that society associates with men.
And these are shaped and constantly reinforced.
Constantly. Through societal expectations, media portrayals, peer pressure, family dynamics, even institutions. Sources like the Men's Mental Health Review and the Handbook really highlight this.
It's like society hands out different scripts or maybe variations on a script depending on your context.
That's a good way to put it. And the handbook also points out just how diverse the study of masculinity is globally. Sometimes it focuses on the problems men create by enacting harmful norms.
Like violence or dominance.
Sometimes on the problems men endure due to societal pressures and expectations.
Like mental health struggles or restricted emotions.
And increasingly exploring the positive potential and the diverse ways masculinity can be expressed.
Okay, so within this landscape of diverse masculinities, there are still dominant forms, like hegemonic masculinity.
Yes, exactly. Those are the idealized, most culturally valued versions of manhood in a given society at a particular time. And these dominant norms often have a significant and sometimes very restrictive impact on emotional expression.
Especially when it comes to vulnerability, or emotions seen as soft or weak.
Precisely. This is where we see that traditional masculinity often links strength to silence, stoicism, resilience.
The strong, silent type ideal.
That's the one, as the Talk to Angel blog explains. The ideal is the guy who can handle anything on his own, doesn't need help, doesn't show distress.
And this creates a kind of internal blueprint, a map.
Yeah, a blueprint where navigating emotions, especially sharing them openly or admitting vulnerability, feels like stepping into foreign territory.
Uncertain, risky.
Yeah.
Even emasculating, to use that word.
Exactly. It feels threatening to that learned identity. It sets up this powerful internal conflict.
You have these very real human emotions, fear, sadness, loneliness, hurt, uncertainty.
But the societal script you've internalized says expressing these openly, relying on others, admitting you don't have it all figured out, that runs counter to being a man.
It feels like a threat to your masculine identity.
Right. And we see a really powerful illustration of this internal negotiation in that PubMed source on masculinity, social connectedness, and mental health, through the real-life example of Steve.
Ah, yes, Steve. His core value was independence, right? Emotional self-sufficiency.
Deeply ingrained. The belief that he should be able to sort it out himself, whatever it was.
There's a quote in the source that really captures it, isn't there?
Yeah. If you've got a bad situation, instead of thinking, oh, poor me, it's just like, what can I do to fix the situation? And that is my focus. I don't really need to talk to anyone about it to get to that conclusion.
Wow. That's the embodiment of that self-sufficiency norm. Focus on action, internal resilience.
Not processing or seeking support through emotion or connection.
And yet the source makes it clear Steve did feel intense, painful emotions when his marriage ended after infidelity.
Oh yeah, he felt embarrassed, felt like a failure about the marriage, worried about how others would see him. Deep stuff.
Emotions that really cry out for processing, for connection.
Absolutely. But despite all that internal turmoil, that distress, he actively chose to keep it all to himself.
Why? The source gives a reason, right?
Yeah, the analysis of his narrative is clear. His main motivation was to avoid being seen as weak or unmasculine.
So by not talking about the pain, by keeping up that facade of self-reliance,
He successfully maintained his practice of self-sufficiency. He stayed aligned with that traditional masculine blueprint, even though it meant suppressing his emotional needs.
the need to uphold the image overrode the need for emotional processing. That's powerful.
And it leads us straight into the underlying fears associated with emotional vulnerability for men. Sources like that Reddit Ask Men discussion and the Talk to Angel blog really dig into this.
There's the universal fear, right? Rejection, shame, inherent in showing any part of yourself that feels flawed.
Definitely. When you show vulnerability, you're essentially saying, here's a sensitive part of me, please handle it with care. The fear is, what if they don't?
What if it's rejected, mocked, used against you?
But the Reddit discussion especially gets at how this fear gets amplified for men by that deeper societal conditioning.
It's not just about feeling a bit embarrassed.
No, it's deeper. It's a fear of the consequences of showing any perceived softness, of being seen as less than what society deems manly.
As one user put it, it's systemic, right?
Yeah.
Embedded in the culture. The fear of losing status as a real man.
Exactly. And that conditioning can lead to fears of specific negative reactions. From other men, maybe the fear of being called names, ridiculed, ostracized.
A whole man-up thing enforced by peers. Someone on Reddit mentioned that.
Yeah, but the discussion also touches on the really complex, sometimes conflicting views men have on how women react to their vulnerability, especially in romantic contexts.
So conflicting views.
Well, one user shares positive experiences, says women have listened, been supportive, which is great.
Okay, good.
But another response offers a much more cautious, maybe challenging perspective. They argue that positive experience isn't universal, meaning that some men have experienced dismissal, or even had their vulnerability subtly or not so subtly weaponized by women, particularly in relationships.
Weaponized.
Maybe used against them in arguments later, or seen as a burden, or somehow misunderstood. It highlights that while many women do create safe spaces, the fear still exists for some men.
Maybe stemming from past negative experiences. Or just perceiving those societal dynamics where male emotional openness isn't always welcomed or trusted.
Right. It just underscores that the path to vulnerability isn't always smooth or predictable for everyone involved. The fear is real, even if the reality varies.
And this pervasive fear, this internal struggle with norms linking strength to silence.
Yeah.
It also connects directly to why some men might be reluctant to seek professional mental health help, right?
Absolutely. That systematic review in Men's Mental Health Matters documents this really clearly.
Because seeking therapy means admitting you need support,
Yeah,
talking about difficult emotions, acknowledging struggles you can't fix alone.
exactly. And within that traditional masculine blueprint where self-sufficiency and stoicism are prized, that act itself can feel like undermining your masculinity, like admitting failure or weakness.
The source even used that powerful phrase, needing to move beyond manning up.
Which perfectly captures the challenge, doesn't it? Those traditional norms create a barrier to accessing the very support needed to deal with the distress those norms might contribute to.
It's a real catch-22, a tough cycle to break.
And this tension between those traditional ideals and the realities of modern life, like needing emotional expression, nurturing roles in families, interdependence, it contributes to what some scholars, cited in the handbook, call a crisis of masculinity.
The old script is clashing with modern demands and opportunities.
Pretty much. Making authentic emotional connection incredibly challenging when the very tools you need for it, like vulnerability and open emotional expression, feel countermasculine.
Creates significant internal conflict.
And can really impact their external relationships, too.
Okay, wow. So we've laid the communication groundwork, then explored how deeply traditional masculinity norms can create barriers to emotion and vulnerability. Now let's try and bring these threads together.
How do these patterns and fears actually impact relationship interactions, day-to-day dynamics, especially during conflict or challenge?
This is where those insights from couple therapy settings become really illuminating. That Canadian Journal article on couples' experiences of vulnerability in therapy,
Yeah.
it makes a crucial point for therapists.
What's that?
That facilitating vulnerability And being responsive when clients do express it is absolutely crucial for effective therapy. Therapists are right there on the front lines with couples grappling with this stuff.
Makes sense. And didn't that study have a really interesting finding about how vulnerability actually felt different depending on the context?
Yes. It noted that clients who felt they shared responsibility for the relationship problems.
The ones who could say, yeah, I played a part in this mess.
Exactly. Those clients felt less vulnerable in that moment of owning their part compared to clients who mostly felt victimized by their partner's actions.
Huh. That's incredibly insightful. So having a sense of agency, some control or ownership, even when admitting something negative about yourself,
Like your own flaws, or how you contributed to a fight.
that somehow buffers the negative feeling of vulnerability, makes it feel less exposing or overwhelming.
It seems so. It feels less like, this awful thing was done to me, I'm helpless, and maybe more like, okay, I messed up here, I own it, now what?
Right. Taking responsibility, even though it's uncomfortable, gives you a kind of footing. It positions you as an active participant, not just a passive victim.
And that sense of agency makes the act of being vulnerable, admitting fault, expressing feelings tied to your own actions, maybe feel less like a total exposure of helplessness. Interesting.
But adding another layer of complexity here, that source on the politics of vulnerable masculinity points out something important.
Which is,
Vulnerability isn't always just about connection or positive change. It can be more complicated.
how so?
It highlights that vulnerability, even a male partner admitting flaws or showing emotion, can sometimes exist within and even subtly support existing power inequalities in the relationship.
Whoa, okay, unpack that. That's a critical nuance.
It means a man admitting vulnerability might not always be a straightforward surrender of power or a move towards equality.
It could be intertwined with other things, like retained aggression or dominance.
Potentially, yes. Presenting what that University of West Georgia source calls contradictory characteristics.
So it's not just if a man says, I feel vulnerable or I messed up. We have to look at the context.
Exactly. What are the underlying power dynamics? Is this vulnerability expressed genuinely, seeking connection on equal ground?
Or is it, maybe consciously or unconsciously, a tactic? Something that still subtly reinforces existing imbalances, or maybe coexist with ongoing aggressive or controlling behavior.
Right. The source notes a man might seem softer in some ways, but aggression is still seen as a natural or acceptable part of his identity. It creates this confusing dynamic.
Vulnerability is present, but it's not necessarily leading to a more equal or safer relationship.
It really challenges us to look beyond the surface expression. What function is this vulnerability serving in the overall relationship pattern and power structure?
Is it an invitation to connect equally? Or is it a performance serving some other purpose? Heavy stuff.
It is. And it also makes you think about how individuals, especially maybe young men navigating early relationships, manage vulnerability around uncertainty or potential rejection.
That University of West Georgia source had an example of this, didn't it, with young men?
Yes, it described a young man, Dylan, managing the intense vulnerability he felt because his girlfriend was ambivalent about their relationship. He wasn't sure where he stood.
Okay, a very vulnerable position. How did he handle it?
Instead of openly expressing his fear, uncertainty, or hurt, his coping mechanism was to negatively script her personality.
What do you mean negatively script her?
He started labeling her as really intense and crazy, a wild, free spirit.
So faced with the vulnerability of not knowing if she was committed, of potentially being rejected, he externalized it, redefined her in negative, unpredictable terms.
Exactly. It served as a way for him to regain some sense of cognitive control, maybe, or to explain away the uncertainty, perhaps make her seem less desirable, or make her potential rejection feel less personal.
Rather than sitting with his own really uncomfortable, vulnerable feelings of insecurity and potential loss, a defense mechanism against that relational vulnerability.
Precisely. And the source also makes an interesting observation in that context.
What's that?
That a man's sexual desire in those situations of relational uncertainty might be viewed as naive or easily played.
Oh, interesting. So it adds another layer, suggesting that in that shaky space of uncertain commitment, even basic things like desire can become points of potential exposure or manipulation or critique.
Yeah, amplifying the fear of rejection beyond just emotional connection to something deeply personal about identity and desire.
Wow. And we also see thinking about that UT Austin's source on relationship satisfaction, that men's valuation of how satisfied they are in a relationship can be linked, at least partly, to sexual satisfaction.
Sometimes prioritizing things like frequency, novelty.
Now, we definitely don't want to overstate this or boil relationship satisfaction down to just sex.
Absolutely not. But it is worth considering how a focus on those specific metrics, which might be tied partly to traditional ideas of masculine sexual performance or prowess.
How that might exist alongside, and maybe sometimes conflict with, the need for deeper emotional connection and vulnerability for overall relationship health.
It's a potential tension, right?
Yeah.
How does a man balance a desire for sexual satisfaction, possibly influenced by those performance norms, with the need to be emotionally open and vulnerable, which we know is key to overall intimacy?
It just paints a picture of the really complex internal landscape men might be navigating, balancing societal expectations, internal feelings of vulnerability, relationship power dynamics, physical intimacy.
It's a constant negotiation, really, between external pressures, ingrained beliefs, internal emotional states, and that fundamental human need for connection.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah, a lot to juggle.
So, given all these layers of complexity, we've uncovered the practical communication hurdles, the deep-seated masculinity norms, the fears around vulnerability, the tricky relationship dynamics, but what can actually help?
Right. How can individuals, how can partners navigate this challenging territory? What are the tools?
This is where we can circle back to those practical communication steps from the beginning.
From psychology today?
Yeah. But now we can reframe them through this crucial lens of navigating vulnerability and the impact of masculinity norms. These steps aren't just generic tips for talking.
They're tools specifically designed to create the kind of environment where emotional openness and vulnerability become possible, even when they feel risky.
Exactly. Think about creating that safe space again, getting comfortable, giving your full, undivided attention, making eye contact.
Why are those so fundamental in this specific context?
Because they signal psychological safety and respect, powerfully, even if non-verbally. They tell your partner, I'm here, I'm listening, you have my focus, I'm willing to be present with whatever difficult or vulnerable thing you bring.
And without that felt sense of basic safety and presence, that fear of rejection or dismissal we talked about becomes almost impossible to overcome.
Pretty much, yeah. Then there's the incredible power of using I statements.
Yes, I feel, not you did.
This step is absolutely critical for initiating vulnerability in a way that can actually be received.
So instead of starting with accusations, you always, you need to change.
You focus on owning and expressing your own internal experience. I feel disappointed when, I felt scared because, I need support with.
How does that help the listener?
Well, first, it takes significant pressure off them. They're less likely to get defensive if they aren't being directly blamed or attacked.
Makes sense. Reduces the need to protect themselves immediately.
But more importantly, for vulnerability, using I statements is essential for initiating self-disclosure, that core component of emotional openness.
You're putting your internal feelings and needs out there, which is inherently vulnerable.
But you're doing it in a way that's less likely to trigger a negative defensive reaction compared to blaming. It creates an opening for dialogue, not immediate confrontation.
Okay, so someone takes that vulnerable step, uses an I statement. What happens next is crucial too, right? How the partner responds.
Vital. This is where active listening and reflection come in.
Steps like don't interrupt and reflect back what you hear them saying.
Absolutely vital. For ensuring that reciprocal communication actually happens, that back and forth needed for connection.
How does reflecting back help? Saying, so what I hear you saying is, or if I understand correctly.
It shows your partner you're truly processing their message, that you care enough to try and understand it accurately, not just waiting for your turn to talk or planning your rebuttal.
It validates their experience, shows you're taking it seriously.
Exactly, which is incredibly crucial when perspectives differ wildly, like during conflict. This practice directly counters that deep fear we discussed.
The fear of being dismissed, misunderstood, having your vulnerability minimized or even used against you.
Right. By accurately reflecting, you're essentially saying, I hear you. Your feelings make sense to me from your perspective, even if I don't fully agree or see it the same way yet. That's huge validation.
Okay, what else? Collaborative language.
Yes, another powerful tool. Helps partners shift focus away from fighting each other towards tackling the problem together.
Recognizing the relationship as that third entity in the room, like the source suggested.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from individualistic concerns like, protecting my masculine self-sufficiency or avoiding discomfort or needing to win towards what's best for the connection, for the us.
It's a subtle shift in mindset, but
Yeah.
sounds fundamental, from my needs versus your needs to what does our connection need from us right now?
Precisely. And when you're working together like that, communicating ideas with tentativeness is also key.
Not presenting solutions as demands. This is what we're doing.
Right, using phrases like, perhaps we could try, or what if I did X and you did Y, or even in a moment of real collaborative vulnerability.
Saying something like, I'm stuck. I honestly don't know how to move forward on this. What do you think we need to do next?
That last example is perfect. It embodies expressing vulnerability productively, collaboratively. You're admitting you don't have all the answers, you don't have it figured out.
You need your partner's input, which can be really hard if you're stuck in that traditional script of always needing to appear competent, in control, decisive.
It shows a willingness to be mutually dependent in solving the problem, sharing the burden. That's an act of vulnerability itself, admitting you can't solve it alone.
And finally, that source emphasized keeping it flowing. What did that mean?
Maintaining that ongoing willingness to listen, really making sure you've heard the message, and crucially, not being afraid to say, I don't know.
When you genuinely don't have the answer or understand something.
Yes, it reinforces openness, humility. It counters that pressure, often tied to masculine norms, to always appear knowledgeable, certain, in charge. It puts authentic connection above appearing infallible.
Okay, so these practical steps, they seem simple on the surface, but when you apply them intentionally.
They create the fundamental conditions needed for partners to feel safe enough to navigate that challenging emotional territory, including confronting the pressures from masculinity norms and the fears around vulnerability.
They build the muscles for emotional intimacy.
Exactly. But it's not just about what happens between the couple using these tools, is it?
No, there are other crucial avenues for support and growth. Things that can help individuals, especially men, build that capacity for vulnerability and emotional expression.
Like professional counseling. Our sources mention that.
Yes, explicitly mentioned as a valuable resource for couples struggling with communication, helping them reconnect and rebuild intimacy.
Counseling offers that structured, neutral, safe space with a trained professional.
Who can guide them, help them practice these skills, identify unhelpful patterns maybe rooted in gender norms, and process the tough emotions that come up when trying to be vulnerable.
It's a dedicated space to really dismantle those barriers.
And building emotional awareness and comfort. It doesn't only have to happen within the intense, high-stakes context of a romantic relationship, right?
Good point. The HelenBrenner.com source mentions the potential benefit of men developing this emotional strength and literacy in contexts outside their romantic partnerships.
Like men's groups.
Exactly. Things like Everyman are cited as examples, spaces where men can connect emotionally with themselves and other men in a structured, supportive way.
And the source makes that crucial point, challenging the old norms head-on. There's no inherent contradiction between masculinity and having or expressing emotions.
Right. These groups offer a space to explore and actually embody that truth.
It's like building that emotional muscle. Recognizing, naming, expressing feelings, seeing other men do it in a space without the unique pressures and history of a specific romantic relationship.
Yeah, it can build confidence and skill that men can then potentially bring back into their closest relationships, making vulnerability feel less like that scary foreign territory.
More like a familiar landscape you know how to navigate.
And we can even briefly link this to concepts from positive psychology, even if they're often applied elsewhere, like work or well-being.
Like what?
Ideas like just identifying feelings, the Eric source mentions this even for managing coworkers. It's a basic but vital skill.
Okay, just naming the emotion.
Cognitive reframing, learning to see challenges, like the awkwardness of vulnerability as opportunities for growth instead of threats.
Shifting perspective.
And guided self-reflection, maybe focusing on past positive experiences with connection, or times vulnerability actually led to a good outcome, reinforcing the benefits.
So learning to just identify, okay, that's fear or that's disappointment is step one.
A fundamental step towards sharing it.
Yeah.
And reframing the anxiety around vulnerability, seeing it as an opportunity for deeper connection rather than just a risk of humiliation that can significantly shift internal resistance.
And remembering times you felt connected or understood can reinforce why emotional openness is worth the risk.
Exactly. These internal practices really complement the external communication skills.
So all these strategies, interpersonal techniques with a partner, professional support, group work, internal emotional practices, they all contribute.
They all help build the capacity and create the necessary environment, both inside and outside, to move towards more authentic, vulnerable, and ultimately more deeply connected relationships.
Okay. We have definitely covered a significant amount of ground in this deep dive.
Wow, we really have. We started by grounding ourselves in those nuts and bolts of effective communication, safety, vulnerability.
Then we took that deep dive into the really complex terrain of how societal ideas about masculinity, especially traditional norms, create those significant barriers to emotional expression and embracing vulnerability.
We looked at specific examples from the sources, like Steve, illustrating how men navigate these challenges, and explored how vulnerability plays out in relationship dynamics in therapy.
Noting those crucial nuances of power, agency, how vulnerability might be perceived differently depending on who's expressing it and how it functions.
And finally, we explored concrete strategies and support, reframing those communication tools like I statements and active listening as ways to build safety for vulnerability.
I'm looking at external resources like counseling and men's groups as vital spaces for growth and skill building.
And it feels really important to reiterate something some of our sources touched on.
What's that?
Understanding how these ideas about masculinity shape vulnerability in communication, it isn't just some interesting academic exercise.
No, it has profound, tangible, real-world implications for your ability to foster healthier, more authentic, more deeply connected relationships in your own life.
Whether you're a man navigating these norms or you're in a relationship with one, it affects everyone.
And importantly, this isn't about judgment, right? It's about understanding.
Exactly. As sources like the handbook point out, these dynamics are often rooted in systemic issues tied to broader social structures and norms, structural gender inequality, they might call it.
We're all navigating complex social conditioning. Recognizing that is key.
It's the first step towards changing it. So we really encourage you, the listener, to take a moment after this deep dive. Reflect a bit.
How might these dynamics be playing out in your own life, your own relationships?
How have societal messages, conscious or unconscious, about gender influenced your own comfort with emotional expression and vulnerability?
Or how do you perceive and respond to it in others? Just thinking about these influences, that's essential work.
And remember that actively applying those communication techniques we discussed, practicing active listening, using I statements, deliberately creating safe spaces, these aren't just soft skills.
No, they're powerful, practical tools for navigating these challenging dynamics rooted in social conditioning, for building that foundation for deeper connection.
And choosing to seek external support, counseling, group work, whatever feels right, that's not a sign of failure or weakness.
Absolutely not. It's a sign of strength, commitment to growth, to relationship health.
It's about actively working against potentially centuries of ingrained patterns, social conditioning.
To build the kinds of relationships that prioritize authentic connection, mutual understanding, and genuine intimacy.
Well said.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into masculinity, vulnerability, and connection, here's maybe a final thought for you to consider, something to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've explored this significant, often really challenging tension between societal expectations that frequently link masculinity to stoicism, toughness, emotional self-sufficiency, independence.
On the one hand.
And on the other hand, the fundamental human need for deep emotional connection, interdependence, and vulnerability in our closest relationships.
That core conflict we kept coming back to.
Exactly. So as gender roles continue to evolve, as individuals increasingly seek more authentic connections, how will we collectively, in our homes, in our communities, reconcile these seemingly conflicting forces?
That's a big question. What does truly authentic connection look like? Not just for men, but for all partners.
When we consciously decide to move beyond manning up, beyond those outdated scripts,
and embrace emotional openness and mutual vulnerability as core components of strength and our most intimate bonds. What does that future look like?
Something to think about.